Hello everybody, it's Basil here, remembering it so that you don't have to. War. War never changes. Since time and memorial, people of all types have found excuses to slice each other up. The conflicts that have been fought over the ages since the dawn of man are uncountable, and being one of the highest causes of human mortality. Because of this, the way many people learn about the past is often through people fighting each other. However, because history is so incredibly deep, it can be rather unfair. We tend to learn about its events quite selectively, choosing ones which have had the most effect on our immediate present. This means that for every conflict that has been taught in school, there are dozens more which remain rather overlooked. There are so many episodes in history that have killed millions which no one besides dedicated academics know about, which does make sense given that we would be wasting our time in history classes if we tried learning about them all. The subject is Eurocentric not because of racist bias, but more simply because of pragmatism. But what are these wars you haven't read? Here is my top 10 list of incredibly deadly conflicts that you have probably never heard of. Before we get into the video, I know this is only my personal choice and not driven by an absolute empirical measurement on what the deadliest wars were, so forgive me if I miss a particular war that you like. Also, I would like to stress that these are going to be highly oversimplified versions of the events of each war, and will lack many details which may be considered crucial. I mean, I can't just drone on about the same conflict for more than 5 minutes. Even then, I'm still going to have to be dividing this video into 2 parts, with the first one being the first 5 conflicts. Finally, I'd like to warn that this video contains discussions of extreme violence and some rather graphic imagery that isn't exactly family friendly. Viewer discretion is advised. With that said, enjoy. Now, it wouldn't quite be a top 10 list if we didn't include some honourable mentions. The first one being the Russian Civil War. Now, whilst the revolution gets a lot of coverage in mainstream history, the actual war which was fought to safeguard it seems to be glossed over as if it was just a novelty. We have to remember that this was a fecking brutal conflict, killing upwards of 5 million, and one which the Reds came surprisingly close to losing when you read about it. It's a war that's universally known, yet very few people really seem to know what exactly happened, which is why it's an honourable mention. The next of the honourable mentions is the war that probably made modern-day China. The Unification Wars made Qin Shi Huangdi the first true Chinese emperor, and is arguably the most seminal moment in the country's history. It was also the site of the Battle of Changping, which would remain the deadliest battle ever for almost a millennia. It's not in the top 10s, however, because there are far deadlier wars waged in Chinese history, one of which we're going to get to real soon. Next were the conquests of Shaka Zulu, which killed upwards of 1.5 million in the 19th century South Africa and left entire parts of the country uninhabited. I was strongly tempted to put this on the main list, however, I decided that there are plenty of more obscure African wars which were more impactful today than this. There is also the fact that the Zulus have been immortalized in modern culture, so they may be obscure but not enough to make it onto the top 10. The last honourable mention is what some historians have called the first truly global world war. The 7 Years' War was fought within 4 different continents and killed up to 2 million. The historical impact of this event is huge, allowing Britain to become the most powerful empire at the time, Russia almost annexing all of Germany, and enabling the creation of the modern United States. Now that we've gotten all of those out of the way, let's get on to the actual list, starting with Number 10, the Algerian War of Independence. I decided to start off with something that's fairly tame, but still criminally underrated, as many people outside the countries which were involved in the following struggle practically never talk about it. I'm of course talking about the deadliest African War of Independence, the fight in French Algeria. Algeria was one of the first countries in Africa to become subjugated by Europeans, with the French taking over in the 1840s and establishing what would be the first of many colonies in Africa. The French would enforce their ideologies and customs upon the hapless Algerians, and for more than a century, there was peace. Everything changed when the Germans attacked. After 2 bloody world wars, France was in a bit of a beleaguered state, to put it mildly. This was most obviously seen when many of her colonies in Africa began to declare independence, and with the French people having no will to fight and keep such territories, they were forced to recognize them as such. But Algeria was different. You see, many Frenchmen over the years had migrated to permanently settle in the land, which had integrated Algeria significantly more than any other French colony in Africa. In fact, Algeria had become practically a part of France since it had elections just as in the mainland. Unfortunately, the local native Algerians still lived there and didn't like it that their country had been absorbed. Since France couldn't just relinquish Algeria peacefully, they tried to gain the favor of the indigenous people by amplifying indigenous politicians who were anti-independence. Unfortunately, it didn't work, and local people decided to take matters into their own hands and formed armed militias to kick the French out by any means necessary. Violence began to really ramp up in 1954 when the National Liberation Front, or FLN, began conducting terror attacks on police forces. They then started targeting and killing French civilians a year later, most notably in the Philippeville massacre. The French responded by indiscriminately shooting any Arabs in the region of the attack. This perpetuated a feedback loop of violence where the FLN would perform an act of terrorism, the French would respond with reprisals, which would make the FLN gain more supporters and increase the deadliness of their actions. Things got so bad that the government soon had to start conscripting French boys from the mainland to assist in quelling the rebellion. But this proved to be a bad political decision since very few wanted to be dragged into such a merciless conflict. Public support for keeping Algeria amongst the French mainlanders drained massively. French politics was dragged into a state of crisis, so Charles de Gaulle decided to oust the government in a coup and end the war in 1962 by recognizing Algeria's independence. Many of the French settlers still living there fled back to the mainland soon afterwards. Around 500,000 people died in the conflict, with the majority of these deaths being Algerian civilians, given that the French tried to resettle millions of them into concentration camps in order to prevent the FLN from gaining more support. Number 9. The War of the Triple Alliance. The following conflict can almost be considered a genocide, given that it ended with the near extermination of an entire people group. Although it isn't really, since many of the things that happened to said victimized group could have been prevented had their dear leader not been so insane. When Latin America gained independence from Spain and Portugal, it quickly became a laboratory for nation building. A number of charismatic military leaders known as caudillos began to pop up and carve out nation-states among the chaos, with notable figures including López de Santa Anna in Mexico, Simón Bolívar in Colombia, and Juan de Rosas of Argentina. But one particular nation that was formed from the anarchy was Paraguay. Paraguay has to be the strangest country in the entire Western Hemisphere. It was founded by a few hundred Spanish explorers who, after subjugating the local Indians, began practicing polygamy with the indigenous women, forming harems of up to 70 wives per Spaniard, which created the modern mestizo Paraguayans. After gaining independence from Spain, they would fall under the dictatorship of Gaspar Rodriguez, who prohibited all same-race marriages in order to homogenize the country's ethnic makeup. After he left, another dictator took power. This time, it was the esteemed Fernando López. López was a proud and delusional leader, believing himself to be a Napoleon-like figure who would conquer a massive empire for Paraguay and South America. Now, the way he found his excuse to wage a giant war is a little complicated, but here's the short version. López supported the Colorado Party in Uruguay as they allowed him to move his ships through the country, which meant that landlocked Paraguay could have a navy. But a Brazilian-backed coup overthrew the Colorados and replaced them with the Blancos, turning Uruguay into a Brazilian puppet. In 1864, López decided to declare war on both countries, but made the stupid decision of moving his troops through Argentina without their permission. Argentina then declared war on Paraguay, thus beginning the single deadliest war in South American history. At first, people believed the war would be quick. After all, how could tiny Paraguay resist its much larger opponents for more than a year? Well, it turns out the Paraguayans fought with an unusual tenacity and grit that made it very difficult to defeat them. López was able to mobilize the entire fighting-age male population of the country and dig himself in, which meant the Brazilians and Argentinians had to throw endless waves of troops at the enemy defenses to make any progress. López refused to surrender to any of the demands of the alliance, even after losing almost all of Paraguay's available manpower. Instead, he decided to start drafting old men and small children into his ranks late into the war where there was no other alternative. Even when most of Paraguay had been captured by the Alliance, Lopez still fought to the bitter end in a guerrilla campaign that only ended in his death in 1870. Exact statistics on the death toll of the war are debated, but what is known is that about 60% of the entire population of Paraguay died in the conflict, and this with all the losses that Brazil and Argentina suffered, and regularly arrive at death counts of over 500,000. Paraguay was able to avoid complete annihilation since the Brazilians believed it should remain a buffer state between it and Argentina. Number 8. The Albigensian Crusade. When you think of the Crusades, you tend to picture hordes of Muslims and Christians hacking each other to death over the disputed ownership of a city that was originally Jewish, and for the most part, this is true. But in the early 13th century, there was a particular kind of non-Muslim people which the Catholic Church just had to deal with. Now, there was once a Christian minority residing in Europe, mostly in southern France, called the Cathars. The Cathars were Gnostic Christians who held many beliefs that greatly differed from those of the Catholic Church, such as reincarnation, vegetarianism, and equal treatment status for women. Throughout the Middle Ages, they were a mostly tolerated people, at least until Pope Innocent III took office. Now, if there's one thing you need to know about Pope Innocent III, is that he was anything but innocent. He had recently been responsible for the disaster of the Fourth Crusade, which had almost completely destroyed the Byzantine Empire. This made him convinced that heresy in Europe needed to be rooted out if further crusading was to be successful, and his next prime target was going to be none other than the Cathars, or Albigensians, as they were coming to be known. In 1209, a large army of knights and common soldiers were gathered in southern France to begin the crusade, which went off to a tremendous start at the town of Béziers. Whilst there was a large contingent of Cathars in the city, most of its inhabitants were Catholic. This didn't stop a massacre from ensuing when the Crusaders entered, killing almost all of the 20,000 citizens. Scenes like this became commonplace throughout northern France, as the Crusaders led a genocidal campaign to rid the heretics, and for a few years they were able to happily ravage the country without much problems. Unfortunately, complications arose when Count Raymond, who possessed many lands in the area, decided to defect and fight against the Crusaders when he thought they had gone way beyond their original goal. This defection set the stage for a never-ending clash between the Crusaders and Raymond with his allies who had come to assist him. Many of the battles that ensued occurred at the city of Toulouse, which, after a year, switched hands several times. By this point, most of the men who had joined the crusade had left, but this didn't stop the most pious figures from trying to finish what they had started. The war dragged on and on and on, until most of the people who had begun it, most notably Pope Innocent, were dead. Fortunately, though, in 1626, King Louis VIII decided that this was getting old and sent the entire army of France to finally crush the heretics once and for all. The crusade finally ended with a swift and brutal campaign which accomplished its mission in a few years. Fighting ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1229. There is debate as to how many died in this 20-year war, but numbers could be anywhere between 200,000 and a million, with most of the dead not being Cathars at all. Number 7. The Nigerian Civil War. Civil wars in post-colonial Africa have always been catastrophic for anyone close to the action. Long, bloody conflicts such as the one in Mozambique or Uganda have displaced and killed countless numbers of civilians given the level of savagery on which they tend to be fought. But one war in particular would stand out from the rest of the scale of the humanitarian crisis which it caused. I would like to begin by saying that Nigeria is a country that shouldn't exist. It was colonized by the British in the late 19th century, and its borders encompass three main tribes: the Hausa, the Yoruba, and finally the Igbo. Remember that last one, because it's going to be the main subject of the war. After Nigeria gained independence from the Brits in 1960, it became evident that the different people groups which comprised the country didn't exactly get along with one another. If anything, there was widespread mistrust amongst all of them, and the group that received the most persecution was none other than the Igbo. Now, the Igbo have always been an industrious and hard-working people, who were able to outcompete members from the other tribes, becoming significantly wealthier. Unfortunately for them, this only made them victims of their own success, as they started to become a target of conspiracy theories and mob attacks by other Nigerians who were getting a little jealous. Naturally, a lot of Igbo began to resent living in Nigeria, especially since whenever there was an election, they were unable to win since the Hausa had considerably greater numbers and could always outvote them, getting in candidates who would favour their group. Nigerian society itself was falling apart, with increasing suspicion towards the government and a flurry of corruption scandals beginning to leak. Several Igbo officers within the Nigerian army seized the opportunity to launch a coup against it in 1966. However, they were defeated by a counter-coup led by other elements in the army which stopped them. When news of the Igbo-led coup got out, thousands of them were killed across Nigeria and millions were displaced. Having enough, the Igbo decided to secede from the country and create their own nation of Biafra. The Nigerian government instantly saw this as unacceptable and declared war on the new state, beginning the Civil War. However, there was a problem. The Nigerian military simply wasn't equipped to quickly overrun Biafra, since their fighters were poorly trained and the terrain was close to impassable. They organized countless offensives that rarely went according to plan, encountering stiff resistance that made advancing really slow. So instead, they decided to whittle Biafra down by blockading the country and preventing it from obtaining any supplies. This proved to be catastrophic for the Biafran population, since they'd become reliant on fish imports from Norway. The resulting famine ended up killing around 2 million people, as Biafran civilians had to resort to eating mostly innutritious starch. In fact, it is arguably where the whole trope of the starving, emaciated African child comes from, since pictures of the crisis were shown on television sets all around the world for the first time. There was also massive backing for both sides by almost every corner on the planet, mainly due to special economic interests that are too complex to cover right here. After almost 4 years of fighting, the Biafrans finally surrendered, and the Igbo were brought into compliance. Over 90% of all deaths from this war were civilian-related, given the troops did surprisingly little fighting. Overall, this was the deadliest civil war in African history, although not the deadliest interstate war. I'll get to that a little later. Number 6. The Bengal Genocide. Bangladesh has one of the most traumatic stories of origin out of any country. In fact, the following was technically a war of independence. However, most scholars agree that this was a genocide, since the perpetrators reacted with such brutality that it's difficult to resist calling it a full-blown extermination. After gaining independence in 1947, things seemed to be looking up for India. But problems quickly began to arise when large numbers of Muslims in the country believed that they would be downtrodden by the majority Hindu population. The solution to this was to create a separate state of Pakistan, which would hopefully stop any ethnic conflict from occurring. Unfortunately, this only led to massive ethnic cleansings against Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus who happened to be on the wrong side of the border that was drawn, which killed about 500,000 people. God, this is off to a great start. Anyway, the new state of Pakistan was quite unstable, having over half a dozen minorities which didn't like living in the same country as one another, and one group in particular that disliked being in Pakistan were the Bengalis. Now, the Bengalis were Muslims like the rest of Pakistan, however that's pretty much the only thing they had in common. In fact, they were completely disconnected from the mainland altogether, as they inhabited the river basins on the Bay of Bengal on the other side of the Indian subcontinent. This unity between western and eastern Pakistan began to be questioned more and more, especially when a massive typhoon devastated large parts of the east in 1970, with little help coming from the federal government. National elections were being held that same year, and the Bengalis overwhelmingly voted for the Awami League, which gave them a considerable leverage over Pakistan's politics. Additionally, there was majority support for secession from Pakistan amongst the educated elite, including university students and academics, who had been campaigning for their goals for quite a while. Many elements in West Pakistan's political sphere refused to form a government with the Easterners. As you can imagine, the Bengalis did not like this, so millions of them took to the streets in protest. Feeling like the situation had gone completely out of control, The Western Pakistani government began creating a hit list of people they thought problematic, and promptly sent in armed forces to deal with the situation. And they did it in the most extreme way possible. Within weeks, the Pakistani military was killing thousands of civilians, especially in the universities where the separatists were concentrated. The sheer brutality employed by the massacres is legendary, and there were many stories that were unimaginably gruesome and horrific. This orgy of rape and violence continued all throughout 1971, and as a consequence, millions of Bengalis were having to flee to India as refugees. The Indian government decided that it would be best to stop the violence and negotiate a peace settlement of some kind. So they decided to invade East Pakistan in December, and shortly afterwards the killing stopped. India forced West Pakistan to recognize East Pakistan as an independent state, creating the nation which we now today know as Bangladesh. There are wildly varying estimates as to how many people were killed in the purge, with sources stating figures all the way from 200,000 to 3 million, given the difficulty of obtaining accurate records, not to mention the close to 500,000 women who were raped. Depending on the numbers that you do trust, this could be the deadliest genocide since the Holocaust. Well, that was part 1. I'll be seeing you in part 2 when the video finally gets uploaded.